Okay, so first of all, we are going to be looking at Tanzu Community Edition. We're in particular going to be choosing the managed cluster route, which allows us to use our local machine, which in our case is Windows, and we're going to install the Tanzu CLI. I already have that actually in place, as you can see, but if you wanted to install that, you could use Chocolatey. If you're on Mac, you could use Brew. If you're on Linux, then obviously you can use Brew as well, but also other ways of being able to install that. So the CLI is really just a way of being able to interact or start the process going to deploy that management cluster. So what we first of all want to do is take this command and jump into our CLI. Let's make this full size. Let's clear this. And what this is going to do is this is going to spin up a local UI that enables us to choose where we want to deploy our management cluster to. So whether that be Docker locally, and I've already done a video on that, whether it's a vSphere environment, or whether it's AWS or Microsoft Azure. So I'm going to choose AWS. I'm going to start fresh. Now this is configured using your AWS CLI. So I already have the AWS CLI configured, and it is authenticated against my credentials. You'd obviously need to do that for your account as well. Now I'm going to deploy everything into EU West 1 in Dublin, which is close to me. Confirm that we can connect, which we can. Next to that, we're going to create a new VPC on AWS for this. We are actually going to just create a development environment. So with that, let's call it Explore, because I'm going to be using this for a demo later on. Now this is important here. So Ec2 Key Pair. If we go into our key pairs, and this is probably timed out for me just now. So let me jump into key pairs. And you can see in this particular region, so Ireland is EU West 1, we have nothing here. So I'm going to create one called Explore. And this is really the way in which we can gain access to our nodes. So Explore is given. So let's call it Explore. Let's leave all of this as default. Let's say EU West 1A. We also want to say N2, or is it M5 large? It's N something large that I want to. Really helps that these aren't in any particular order, it seems. Let's M5.large, and then we're going to do the same here for our worker nodes. So this is going to be our control plane, this is going to be our worker instance. Next to that, we're going to leave the optional metadata out. We're going to use the default Kubernetes network that's been suggested. We are going to disable or not use an OIDC for this, and we're going to use the Amazon image or OS image for our nodes. Review that configuration. Yep, we've just been through it, so we know what that looks like. And then what we're going to see is it's going to go ahead and it's going to go and create. Now that should have been deleted, so let's jump back into stacks. And it's literally just created this. And if I go up to this dashboard, what we'll see over time, and this generally should take around 20 minutes, depending obviously on a lot of different variables, is that we should start seeing security groups grow, instances grow, etc. So with that, we can keep an eye on this, and this will continue to run through that. The other thing while that's doing that is that config that we've just created actually becomes part of, if you go to this if you go to this folder within your system, .config Tanzu tkg cluster configs, you'll see that we have a YAML file that contains all the configuration that we just added. So whether it be like the different AZ and stuff like that. And what we're going to do, and if you're following along with the documentation, so we've just gone through a lot of this area. One of the things that I found not particularly clear was around that Ec2 key pair. So C, yes, it is noted here for instructions on creating a key pair. I actually think it would be better if it documented, well, what does that mean? Where do I need to go to make that happen? Anyway, so we've gone through all of this very quickly in our video, and then once that's done, so this will take a bit of time, and we'll see the configuration at the end of that. So hopefully we should start to see things happening very soon. And then we can catch up there. One thing I am going to do is, here it says about deploying a workload cluster. So I'm going to cheat ever so slightly. I'm going to take a copy of that. I'm going to paste that one in. I'm going to then rename that workload, as in workload cluster. And then I'm going to go and edit that. And I'm simply going to change one thing, and that is going to be where the name here, the cluster name is cluster explore. I'm going to make this WRK, and then be done with that. So then when we come to use that later in the demo, you'll see that. So fingers crossed. Let's if we go into this dashboard, so you see here we have one security group. That's by default within that's the default security group that's created. Eventually we'll start to see that. I think it grows to about 7 different security groups. We should have, I think it's around 3 instances running, etc., around that. So here we go. So we're starting to see we're creating a local cluster here on our, again, if I just open up another one of those PowerShells, we can see that under Docker PS, you can see that we're now bootstrapping everything from our Docker image here as our control plane, which then interacts with AWS and spins up everything that we need in there. So actually what we're doing is we're not doing much. We're setting up the bootstrapper. The bootstrapper created a kube config, blah, 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 installing the providers, installing the cert manager, etc. All on this local copy at the moment. We're not actually touching anything to do with AWS as far as I'm aware just yet. You can see that it's not changed. So we're installing those providers there. And then, so this logs is also what you'll see if you have this up and running. You see, so fetching providers, installing the cert manager, installing provider, cluster API, bootstrap, kubeadm, control plane, blah blah blah, and start creating that. So what we're going to do is we're now going to wait for that control plane to be provisioned. And we should start to see, there we go, there's the first security group, the one that we decided to create. And this happens quite quickly. If you then do a refresh on that, you can start to see that the CloudFormation template is also ticking along nicely. And now we're in that state again of just waiting for everything to begin to come up. Okay, so as you can see there, we have a new control plane and we have our bastion, we have our worker node. So we have our 3 entities, I guess is the best way to put it, and then we're just finalizing some of the last add-ons and other packages that we need to have deployed within that cluster. And if we take a look at the documentation, where up here, validate the management cluster has started successfully. If we take a copy of that to begin with, I'm pretty sure if I run this, yeah, it's not going to come up just yet. Or maybe I want the get. I must have just hit it as that completed. There you go. All green ticks, all good stuff. Back into here. You see here that we have our explore management cluster. And in theory, I think the instructions tell you that you have to go and get your kube config and do all of that, the next steps. But the way I did this earlier actually looked kubectl config get context. Yeah, it's automatically put it in there, but because I had something set before, let's just explore admin at explore kubectl get nodes. Okay, good stuff. So now we get to see our worker node and our control plane. Okay, so that's our worker node up and running. Like, we don't have to worry about this. So it seems that the documentation may need to be updated. I guess it depends on a few different variables within your system as to whether that works. So, okay, yeah, completed that. So deploy a workload cluster. Now remember, I copied this. So ultimately what I did in here by creating this workload, I basically just copied using the UI rather than using the command line copy functionality, and I basically just changed it so that it was explore WRK. So what we generated, so to create it, we are going to run Tanzu cluster create. So let's jump back in here. Let's Tanzu cluster create. We're going to create something called explore WRK. We're going to point it to our file that we mentioned. If I remember where it is. In fact, let me cheat. I think we define a file. I'll go and double check that. Yeah, file, and then the location of that file. So back in here, we just say workload, and we see that YAML. So what this is going to do is this is going to create our workload cluster. So this is going to consist of another bastion, a worker node, and a control plane. So again, we're at about 22 minutes from start to finish here. I've obviously sped things up a little bit, but basically what we're going to see now, in fact this might moan a touch about, this is where I might bring in and talk about, so this is actually going to go away and deploy that workload cluster. Now one thing that I had to do was I had to set an environment variable that allowed me to do that. So here we go, we can see everything's good, but one thing that you'll see is an AWS region if you haven't configured that. So let me open up another PowerShell, but basically if I jump through back to my commands, there's a setx. Basically on Windows in particular, obviously you can create variables in any of the operating systems that this is supported on, but prior to recording I'd already set use setx to create this AWS region, EU-West-1. So it knew where to run. If you're running the CLI for some reason, even though we've defined it in the YAML, we have to define it here as part of that variable as well. So that's why this is then ticking along and going for it from that perspective. So just remember that this also needs to be defined. I'm pretty sure that that's why this is up and running from that perspective. So on here, you can see here, so just from the management cluster, we have 7, one of those being the default, 6 being what we brought in because of what we did from an explore point of view. If we keep an eye on this, we are going to see everything expand and have now explore-WRK as a bastion, as a worker, as a control plane. This is now done with. So let's just take a look here. Basically, we just keep an eye on things here until everything's up and running from that perspective. Then, once we've got that up and running and it's working, we'll do a Tanzu cluster list. At the moment, there'll be nothing there. Capture the workload clusters kubeconfig. Now, I believe we do have to do this one. And then we can use the kubectl config, use context, cluster name, etc. to jump into that, and then we can start using it as a Kubernetes cluster. So with that, let's just wait a few moments for our, there we go. So we see explore WRK bastion. I'm not sure if we actually need a bastion host to get into this environment. Obviously that's part of the YAML file that we configured. So I'm not going to get too into that, but we could obviously take that out of the YAML if need be. It's obviously more expense on that. So with that, we can just keep refreshing this, and we'll eventually, probably less time, but let's give it the same 20 minutes to go and deploy a workload cluster. I don't think it'll be that long though. Okay, so now we have our workload cluster available to us, but if I do a kubectl get context, you'll see that we still only have our management cluster. So what we have to do here is we have to go and grab that. So what we're going to do is we're going to run Tanzu cluster kubeconfig get Tanzu cluster kubeconfig get explore admin, I think. And then if we do a get context again, and if we jump over to that, kubectl config use context explore WRK admin at explore WRK kubectl get nodes, we now have our worker cluster. So this is where we can deploy all of our applications and do everything that we wish to do. Now, deploying a package, I'm not going to worry too much about this, but obviously you could go away and you could deploy your packages that you wish to within your environment. So that this is basically, if you think about packages within VMware Tanzu as like add-ons, I'm a big fan of Minikube actually, and Minikube do it really well, very similar in fact, around a set of tools that generally go hand in hand with your Kubernetes cluster. So if we think about FluentD from a login point of view, Cert Manager from a certification point of view, Knative, etc., Prometheus, if we want to have those as standard within our packet or within our Kubernetes cluster, then we could then look at seeing what's available and deploying them very simply within our environment. These are tried, tested, and yeah, very easy to deploy. So on top of that, then the only thing next up is being able to delete them. Now, because again, that setx that I mentioned earlier, that again will require that variable within your Windows system or within any of the operating systems that you run. So bear that in mind when you come to delete the workload cluster first. And once that's gone, and once you hit that command, that Tanzu cluster delete cluster name, you could use Tanzu cluster list and just keep an eye on that deletion process. And once it's disappeared, it's gone. Then you can go through and you can go and delete that the management cluster, and it's the management cluster that requires that that region to be defined. Yeah, but with that, hopefully that was useful.